The night Ethan Cole realized something was terribly wrong did not begin with pain or panic. It began with rain. Cold Pacific rain hammered against the glass walls of a high-rise apartment overlooking Lake Union in Seattle, blurring the city lights into long trembling streaks. It was nearly midnight, the hour when logic usually won, when numbers behaved, when code either compiled or it didn't. Ethan trusted that kind of world. Cause and effect. Input and output. Nothing in between. Ethan was 32, an elite software engineer known inside his company for solving problems other teams avoided. He believed the human body worked the same way as a system. If something failed, there had to be a bug. You traced it, isolated it, fixed it. That belief had guided his entire adult life. Until this night. It started weeks earlier with nausea. Not stress nausea. Not the kind that came from too much coffee or missed meals. This was different. It arrived like clockwork. Early mornings. Late nights. Triggered by smells that had never bothered him before. Fried eggs. Colleague perfume. Even the clean metallic scent of rain on concrete. Ethan vomited until his throat burned, yet medical scans showed nothing wrong. Perfect liver. Clean stomach. No tumors. No infections. That night, after another violent episode in the bathroom, his wife Marla sat on the edge of the tub watching him breathe like a man surfacing from deep water. Her eyes weren't panicked. They were focused. Remembering. She had worn that same expression years earlier when she was pregnant with their daughter. Marla didn't say anything at first. She stood, walked into the bedroom, opened a forgotten drawer, and returned holding a small white stick still sealed in plastic. Ethan laughed weakly when he saw it. He thought it was a joke. A cruel one. Minutes later, alone in the bathroom, Ethan followed the instructions with mechanical precision, already planning how he would prove this ridiculous idea wrong. He placed the test on the counter. Turned away. Counted breaths. When he looked back, the world he trusted collapsed. 2 pink lines. Clear. Bold. Undeniable. Ethan stared as if the object might blink first. His mind raced through explanations faster than fear could catch up. Defective test. Chemical error. Humidity interference. Anything except the impossible conclusion forming in the silence of that small, brightly lit bathroom. When Marla saw his face, she didn't need to look at the test. She already knew. Outside, thunder rolled across Seattle. Inside, Ethan Cole sat on the cold tile floor holding proof that reality had just broken its own rules. He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment, American medicine was about to confront a case no textbook had prepared for. Morning arrived without relief. The rain had stopped, but the nausea had not. Ethan woke before dawn with the same hollow twisting in his abdomen, the kind that felt less like illness and more like something demanding attention. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to Marla's quiet breathing beside him, wondering how a single plastic stick could turn his body into an unsolved equation. By mid-morning, they were driving through downtown Seattle toward a private medical center overlooking Elliott Bay. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt dangerous, as if saying the wrong thing out loud might solidify a nightmare that still felt unreal. Ethan kept replaying the image of the test in his mind. 2 lines. Not faint. Not questionable. Definitive. At the clinic, the receptionist glanced at the intake form and hesitated when she saw the requested blood panel. Beta HCG. For a male patient. She looked up, confused, then professionally looked away and typed without comment. That silence felt heavier than judgment. Blood was drawn. Tubes filled. Labels printed. Ethan watched the deep red liquid flow from his arm and felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing someone else's life from a distance. He told himself this would end soon. Numbers would come back normal. Logic would reassert itself. He would apologize to Marla for letting imagination run wild, and they would go back to worrying about deadlines and school pickup times. They didn't. The endocrinologist called them in less than 2 hours later. That alone set Ethan's pulse racing. Doctors did not rush for good news. The physician, Dr. Randall Moore, was in his late 50s with the calm voice of someone who had delivered difficult information many times. But even he looked unsettled. He turned the screen toward them. Ethan's beta-HCG level was over 15,000. The room felt suddenly smaller. The air heavier. Dr. Moore explained carefully that in men, elevated HCG was most often associated with aggressive cancers. Testicular, germ cell, endocrine malignancies that could hide silently until late stages. The words landed like blows. Cancer made sense. It fit the rules. It was terrifying, but it was logical. Ethan felt an unexpected wave of relief mixed with dread. At least cancer had an explanation. At least it had protocols. Treatments. A path forward. They moved fast after that. Ultrasounds. CT scans. Tumor markers. Everything came back clean. No masses. No lesions. No malignant activity anywhere in his body. Each normal result should have been comforting. Instead, it made the situation worse. Because the hormone kept rising. Another blood draw the next morning confirmed it. The pattern was not erratic. It was structured. Incremental. Predictable. Like a chart from an obstetrics textbook. Dr. Moore leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and rubbed his temples. He admitted what no physician liked to say. He did not understand what they were seeing. He made a call, then another. By afternoon, Ethan was transferred to a major research hospital affiliated with the University of Washington. There, the tone changed. This was no longer routine care. It was investigation. Radiologists reviewed scans in silence. Specialists whispered outside doors. A senior maternal-fetal medicine expert was quietly consulted despite the obvious absurdity of the situation. Finally, an MRI was ordered. Full abdominal imaging. High resolution. Ethan lay inside the machine, the rhythmic pounding echoing in his skull. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on numbers. Algorithms. Anything familiar. When the table slid out and technicians avoided eye contact, he knew. The conference room was full when they brought him back in. Too full. Doctors from different departments stood around illuminated screens. No one smiled. One of them gestured to an image on the display. There, nestled among loops of intestine and connective tissue, was a distinct structure. Encapsulated. Vascularized. Not a tumor. A gestational sac. Someone said the words abdominal pregnancy. Someone else said unprecedented. Another said impossible, then stopped talking entirely. Ethan did not hear most of it. His ears rang. His hands went cold. He felt the room tilt as if gravity had shifted. Inside his body, something was growing. Something alive. Not metaphorically. Not hormonally. Literally. Marla reached for his hand as the lead physician spoke again, explaining risks in a voice that sounded far away. Internal bleeding. Organ failure. Mortality rates. But Ethan was no longer thinking about death. He was thinking about the undeniable truth that his body was doing something it was never meant to do. And that whatever was inside him was fighting just as hard to stay alive. The impossible had moved past theory. It was now visible on a screen. And nothing in Ethan Cole's life would ever return to normal again. By the time the word pregnancy was spoken out loud without hesitation, Ethan no longer felt shock. What replaced it was something far heavier and harder to name. It was the slow realization that his body was no longer entirely his. That somewhere beneath skin and muscle, among organs that had quietly served him for decades, another life had claimed space and purpose. The hospital placed Ethan under immediate observation. Not because they knew what to do, but because they knew how dangerous not knowing could be. A private room was cleared on a secured floor normally reserved for high-risk patients. Nurses checked his vitals every hour. Blood pressure, oxygen, heart rate, hormone levels. Everything was monitored with obsessive care, as if constant attention alone might prevent disaster. A multidisciplinary team formed within 48 hours. Surgeons, vascular specialists, endocrinologists, radiologists, bioethicists. Each brought knowledge. None brought certainty. Every scan showed the same thing. The fetus was not in a uterus because there was no uterus. It had implanted deep within Ethan's abdominal cavity, anchoring itself to a web of blood vessels that fed his intestines. Those vessels were never designed to nourish another being, yet they had adapted, expanded, strengthened. The placenta was aggressive, efficient, alive. Doctors explained that abdominal pregnancies were already among the most dangerous complications in women, with mortality rates frighteningly high even in controlled settings. In a male body, the risk was exponentially greater. There was no natural structure to stretch. No muscular womb to protect. No biological fail-safe. Every day the fetus grew, the danger multiplied. Ethan listened as calmly as he could while probabilities were discussed. Internal hemorrhage. Organ compression. Sudden rupture. Death within minutes if bleeding could not be controlled. Someone said the phrase ticking clock. Another said medical history. When the conversation turned to options, the room went silent. Immediate termination would likely save Ethan's life but carried significant surgical risk. Continuing the pregnancy could result in the loss of both father and child at any unpredictable moment. No protocol existed. No precedent to follow. Whatever decision was made would be written into journals long after Ethan was gone. That night, alone in the dim hospital room, Ethan stared at his abdomen in the mirror. It looked almost the same. Slightly bloated, maybe. Nothing dramatic. Yet beneath the surface, his body had transformed into a battleground between survival and creation. He placed his hand over his stomach without thinking. The gesture felt wrong at first, then strangely natural. He didn't feel movement yet, but he felt presence. A heaviness that was not pain. More like awareness. Marla sat beside him, exhausted but steady. She didn't try to persuade him. She didn't talk about miracles or faith. She simply asked one question in a quiet voice. What do you feel when you think about it being gone? Ethan closed his eyes. He pictured the screen. The sac. The faint flicker doctors had hesitated to call a heartbeat but eventually had to acknowledge. The thought of erasing it made his chest tighten in a way no fear ever had. I feel like I'd be killing something that's trying really hard to live, he said. The following morning, the ethics board convened. Papers were signed. Warnings repeated. Legal language outlined every possible outcome. Ethan listened carefully, then did what he had always done when facing an impossible problem. He chose to take responsibility. He told them he wanted to continue. The decision rippled through the hospital like electricity. Some doctors disagreed openly. Others admired the resolve but feared the consequences. Arrangements were made to move Ethan into a specialized isolation unit equipped for constant imaging and rapid surgical intervention. He became both patient and project. As weeks passed, changes became impossible to ignore. His nausea intensified. His appetite shifted unpredictably. Scents overwhelmed him. His body temperature fluctuated. Hormones surged and crashed, reshaping not just his physiology but his emotions. He cried unexpectedly. He snapped over nothing. Then apologized, confused by himself. The first time he felt movement, it happened late at night. A small flutter. So faint he almost dismissed it as gas. Then it happened again. A deliberate nudge from inside. Ethan froze. His hand pressed against his abdomen as tears filled his eyes without warning. The fear was still there. The danger was still there. But now there was something else. Connection. The doctors could call it an anomaly. A case. A phenomenon. But to Ethan, it was becoming something far more personal. The line between patient and parent had blurred. And with each passing day, the cost of turning back grew heavier than the risk of moving forward. Time inside the hospital began to lose its familiar shape. Days were no longer measured by meetings, meals, or sunsets over the water, but by scans, vitals, and the slow, relentless progression of numbers on charts. Ethan learned quickly that continuing the pregnancy was not a single decision, but a decision he had to recommit to every morning when he woke up still alive. By the start of the second trimester, his body was no longer pretending nothing was happening. His abdomen firmed and pushed outward in a way that made even the most skeptical doctors pause. This was not swelling. This was growth. The muscles of his core, once strong and compact, were being forced to adapt to pressure they were never designed to endure. Eating became a strategic exercise. Too much food caused pain. Too little left him weak and dizzy. Nurses adjusted his diet daily, trying to balance nutrition for two bodies sharing one bloodstream. The fetus grew fast. Too fast. Ultrasound sessions became longer and more frequent. Specialists tracked blood flow with Doppler imaging, watching the placenta's invasive network cling to Ethan's intestinal vessels like roots gripping fragile soil. Every scan carried a question no one dared to ask out loud. Would this be the one where something tore? Doctors warned him repeatedly not to move suddenly. Not to strain. Not to cough too hard. Not to laugh too hard. Not to exist too freely. His bed was gradually angled upright because lying flat made it difficult to breathe. The growing mass pressed upward against his diaphragm, stealing lung capacity inch by inch. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. Pain followed. Not sharp at first, but deep and constant. A pulling sensation that radiated through his abdomen and lower back, as if his insides were being rearranged against their will. Pain medication was offered carefully. Too much could affect the fetus. Too little left Ethan shaking and drenched in sweat. Emotionally, the shift was just as severe. Hormones flooded his system in waves that made him feel unrecognizable to himself. He cried watching a commercial about family dinners. He became irrationally angry when a nurse moved his pillow without asking. Then guilt crashed in afterward, heavy and humiliating. Marla remained by his side as much as the hospital allowed. She learned to read the monitors as well as the nurses. She noticed changes before alarms sounded. She became his anchor when his own mind turned against him. Some nights she slept upright in a chair, holding his hand through the hours when fear grew louder than reason. Outside the hospital walls, whispers began. A nurse said something to a colleague. A technician mentioned an unusual case to a friend. By the time Ethan noticed the looks lingering too long in the hallway, the secret was already leaking into the world. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Headlines danced dangerously close to the truth without fully naming it. The hospital tightened security. Non-essential staff were reassigned. Ethan was moved to a more isolated wing. The message was clear. This was no longer just about survival. it was about control. At 24 weeks, viability was discussed. The word hung in the air like a fragile promise. If something went wrong after this point, there was at least a chance. A chance for the baby. A chance for meaning if everything else fell apart. That night, alone except for the soft hum of machines, Ethan felt a strong, unmistakable kick. Not a flutter. Not an accident. A deliberate movement that pushed hard enough to make his breath catch. He laughed and cried at the same time. For the first time since this began, the fear receded just enough for something else to surface. Purpose. Whatever biology said, whatever science argued, there was no denying the truth his body was teaching him. He was no longer just enduring this. He was carrying it. And with each passing day, the line between risk and responsibility grew thinner, while the bond between Ethan and the life inside him grew impossible to ignore. The third trimester arrived without ceremony, but it announced itself through suffering. By the time doctors marked 30 weeks on Ethan's chart, his body had reached a state no one in the hospital had ever witnessed before. His abdomen was no longer just enlarged. It was tense, rounded, and unmistakably gravid, a physical declaration that defied every medical assumption he had grown up believing. Breathing became labor. Each inhale felt shallow, burrowed, as if his lungs were negotiating for space they could no longer fully claim. The fetus had pushed upward, compressing his diaphragm and forcing his ribcage to expand in ways that made his chest ache constantly. He slept propped upright by pillows and adjustable supports, drifting in and out of shallow rest while machines tracked every fluctuation in his vitals. Movement was restricted to the bare minimum. Walking was discouraged. Standing too long caused dizziness and sharp internal pressure. Even turning in bed required assistance. The placenta, now large and deeply embedded, had wrapped itself around critical blood vessels feeding his intestines. Imaging showed a dense, branching network that looked disturbingly like roots cracking through concrete. One rupture. One tear. One spike in blood pressure could end everything in minutes. Doctors imposed strict bed confinement. For Ethan, that loss of independence cut deeper than pain. He had spent his life solving problems through action, through control. Now he was ordered to remain still, his survival dependent on restraint rather than effort. Simple acts like using the restroom or adjusting his position became coordinated events involving nurses and careful timing. The psychological toll was immense. Hormonal shifts intensified. His moods swung unpredictably. He experienced sudden waves of sadness that left him gasping, tears soaking the pillow without warning. At other times, anxiety tightened around his chest so fiercely he feared his heart might give out before his abdomen did. Psychiatrists were quietly added to his care team, not because he was unstable, but because what his mind was enduring was as unprecedented as what his body was carrying. Marla never left for long. She learned how to help reposition him without triggering pain. She memorized the cadence of the fetal heartbeat on the monitor and panicked when it changed even slightly. She shielded him from news, from rumors, from the world that was now circling his story like a storm. Despite the fear, there were moments of unbearable tenderness. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the hospital window, the baby kicked repeatedly, strong and insistent. Ethan placed his hand over the movement, his palm trembling. For the first time, he spoke out loud to the life inside him. "Easy," he whispered. "I'm still here." The kicks slowed, then settled. Doctors began planning the inevitable. There was no scenario in which this pregnancy could reach a natural end. The risk of catastrophic bleeding increased daily. At 34 weeks, the consensus hardened. Waiting longer was gambling with death. A surgical delivery would be attempted at 36 weeks, under the most controlled conditions possible. The operating plan was unlike anything in the hospital's history. Multiple surgical teams would be present at once. Trauma surgeons, vascular specialists, neonatologists. Blood banks were alerted. Supplies stockpiled. Every possible complication was listed, rehearsed, contingency mapped. Ethan was briefed in detail. No sugarcoating. No false optimism. They explained that once the baby was removed, his body would lose the internal pressure that had been containing the placenta. The greatest danger would come after success. Massive hemorrhage. Shock. Organ failure. They told him there was a real chance he would not wake up. That night, Marla held his face in her hands and cried silently. Ethan felt an unfamiliar calm. Fear was still there, but it had been overtaken by something steadier. Acceptance. Resolve. He asked for a notebook. Over the next days, between pain and exhaustion, he wrote. Not technical notes. Not explanations. Letters. Messages to the child he had carried through fear, ridicule, and pain. He wrote about the night of the rain. About choosing to stay. About how love had rewritten everything he thought he knew about strength. As the surgery date approached, Ethan's body reached its limit. Swelling worsened. Pain spiked despite medication. Internal pressure caused frequent alarms on the monitors. Doctors increased their watch, knowing the margin for error was vanishing. On the final night before surgery, Ethan lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of 2 heartbeats on the monitor. His and the baby's. Separate. Intertwined. He placed his hand on his abdomen one last time before sleep finally claimed him. Whatever happened next, he had already crossed a line no one else had. And he knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that he had not carried this life in vain. The morning of the surgery arrived without sunrise. Thick gray clouds hung over Seattle, pressing low against the hospital windows, muting the city into something distant and unreal. Inside the operating wing, time narrowed to procedures and preparation. Ethan was awake when they came for him, his body exhausted beyond resistance, his mind strangely clear. As the gurney rolled through the corridor, he watched ceiling lights pass overhead in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He focused on that movement because focusing on anything else felt dangerous. Nurses spoke calmly. Hands adjusted lines and monitors. Someone asked him to confirm his name. Someone else asked him to breathe deeply. The familiarity of protocol grounded him. This was still a system. Still steps. Still order. Marla walked beside him until the last possible door. She didn't cry this time. Her eyes were red, but steady. She squeezed his hand and leaned close enough for him to hear her over the hum of machines. "We're waiting for you," she said. "Not if. When." Ethan nodded. He wanted to say something profound. Something worthy of the moment. But all that came out was, "Take care of him." Inside the operating room, the scale of what was about to happen became unmistakable. More people than Ethan could count moved with controlled urgency. Surgeons from multiple specialties stood in place, each responsible for a different line between survival and catastrophe. The air felt heavy with concentration. No one spoke unnecessarily. As anesthesia took hold, Ethan felt his body slipping away from him layer by layer. The last thing he was aware of was the sound of a monitor accelerating slightly, then fading. The surgery lasted hours. When the baby was delivered, there was a moment of suspended silence. Then a cry cut through the room. Strong. Loud. Alive. A sound so full of insistence that several people later admitted they had to step back to steady themselves. The child weighed just over 4 kilograms. That fact alone stunned the room. No one had expected such size, such vitality, given the environment he had developed in. The neonatology team moved swiftly, but there was relief in their movements. This was not a rescue. This was a welcome. For Ethan, the danger was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. As predicted, the removal of internal pressure triggered instability. Blood pressure dropped sharply. Alarms sounded. Teams shifted roles instantly. What followed was not panic, but precision. Blood transfusions. Vascular control. Hours of careful intervention designed to keep his body from unraveling under the stress it had endured for months. When the final sutures were placed and the last monitor stabilized, the room exhaled as one. Ethan was alive. He woke in the intensive care unit much later, floating between pain and awareness. The first sensation was absence. The heavy, constant pressure that had defined his existence for months was gone. In its place was a deep, aching emptiness and a pain that felt earned. Marla was there. She noticed his eyes open and leaned over him, her hand trembling as it found his. Tears slid down her face before she could stop them. She laughed softly through the crying, pressing her forehead to his. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He's perfect." Ethan couldn't speak yet. His throat burned. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. But when she showed him the photo on her phone, something inside him broke open in the best possible way. The baby's face was unmistakably human. Warm. Real. Not a concept. Not a miracle story. A child. Tears escaped his eyes without permission. Recovery was not gentle. Days blurred together under medication, monitoring, and slow healing. Infection was a constant threat. Pain came in waves. Emotion followed closely behind. When the hormones that had flooded his system vanished abruptly, the crash left him raw and vulnerable. He cried often. Sometimes without knowing why. Doctors explained it clinically. Postpartum hormonal withdrawal. Psychological adjustment. But Marla understood it instinctively. She never rushed him through it. Never told him to be strong. She simply stayed. The first time Ethan held his son, his arms shook with the effort. The baby was warm and solid against his chest, breathing softly, utterly unaware of how fiercely his existence had been fought for. Ethan closed his eyes and felt something settle inside him that had been restless his entire life. Peace. Weeks later, when Ethan was strong enough to sit by the window, he watched the city move again. Cars. People. Ordinary lives continuing. His own life would never be ordinary again. The scar across his abdomen would remain. The memory would never fade. But neither would the certainty that love had carried him through something no logic ever could. He had entered this story as a man who believed the world obeyed rules. He left it as a father who knew that sometimes, the most powerful force in the human body is not biology or reason, but the decision to protect life at any cost. And that decision had changed everything.